Howdy folks, my name is Tony and these are the outtakes of an observer. I thought a lot about what the first episode of this series should be, and I think I wanted to tell you guys a story of an experience that I had. The Caretakers Everywhere at the End of Time is a 6.5 hour long concept album that demonstrates the experience of progressively worsening Alzheimer's. It does this by starting in the first stage with old, nostalgic, sort of 40s ballroom music, and as it moves forward, that music slowly becomes more and more distorted and warped and becomes a whisper of an hollowed out husk of its former self. But I'd recommend listening to it first because I'm going to get into some spoilers about the ending. So, the first time that I heard about it was from a Solar Sands video where I think it was his "Can You Name Anything in This Photo" video. It's a very good video. And after watching that, I listened to the album multiple times, either partially or in full. But I don't think I will soon forget the first time that I had ever listened to it. The first time that I ever listened to it was on a Friday, and that was probably a bad choice because on Fridays I have to drive me and my aunt around to a couple of different jobs for cleaning. So essentially I only got to listen to the album while I was working, and then the experience kind of got interrupted a couple of times so that we could drive from place to place. But I remember specifically choosing not to turn on the radio as to not reset sort of my emotional level as I worked my way through the album. And that was a really interesting choice because of the repercussion it had later that day. As I went through the day, the album slowly became more and more unbearable. And I remember trying to eat dinner and feeling just depressed, essentially. Just almost feeling nothing. I think I was roughly halfway through the album by that point. And we had one more job at the end of the day. So on the ride there, I continued listening to the album on my phone. And I think it was around stage 5-ish by the time that we got to the job. And in that portion, it is essentially, it sounds of a haunted, howling wind. And any semblance of music at that point had almost completely left the album. And by the time that I got to the job, it was at stage 6, where any sense of emotional anything kind of just completely leaves. And while I was at the job trying to do it with this music playing, I became more and more lethargic and slow and unable to concentrate on anything. And by that time, it was nearing the end of the album. Well, the 6th album. It's essentially 6 parts, but the 6.5 hour thing is just kind of a collection of all of them. By the end of it, I had become so depressed and unable to move. I was just stuck, frozen in a chair, listening to these sort of droning notes that filled me with nothing but despair, I think is the best word to describe it. Although it claims, on the video's description, it claims that stage 6 is beyond description, but if I were to summarize it in one word, it would be despair. The last roughly 10 minutes of the album is filled by one last musical piece. And at this point, you had been listening to almost nothing but sort of ambient, disparaging noise that would drill and grind you down. After having forgotten everything, after being brought down into the deepest nothingness that you could experience, it brings you one last respite of a modicum of music. It's a slow piece that reminds you of what once was and what could happen when everything is lost. The way that I interpreted the end track the first time that I listened to it was my death. It felt as though it was one final fleeting memory before letting go. You're enveloped in darkness and expire. And realizing this in real time was absurd, to say the least. It was disturbing and it was unsettling to feel as though that I was experiencing my own death. And sat there in a chair for quite a few minutes, just staring at a clock, watching the time go by. My dad comes over and he gets mad at me for not working. And he's yelling at me about being lazy and wasting time and making us stay there too long. And I not only didn't have the energy to explain to him why I couldn't move, but even if I did, I don't think he would understand the experience that I just went through. And for that being the first time that I had ever listened to the album, it for that to be the first time that I had ever listened to it, the experience and the emotion that I went through became burned into my memory. And if that was the experience that I had the first time listening to that album, I'm not 100% sure why I've gone back to listen to it multiple times, but it sure is something quite fascinating. I've been Tony. I've always been Tony, and I'll never stop being Tony. You're you. You've always been you, and never stop being you. And have a good day.